Hello and welcome to the 14th of April in history, Tales from the House. My name is Stephen Dalton and I've got two things to talk to you about today, but they're both pretty big things. That's why there's only two. Firstly, today in 1865, let's get the big news out of the way. President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about this and some of the strangeness that surrounds it. But to begin with, we'll start with Abraham Lincoln himself, and we will have a look at some particular special things about him, because he was a president of some firsts. He was, for example, the first bearded president ever. And they say even today that, if you want to be elected or be prime minister in this country, you can't really have a beard or a moustache. It's the trend. But back then, he was the first bearded president ever to be elected. And that's not the only thing. He was also the first president to be inducted into the Hall of Fame for wrestling. He was a notable wrestler. I bet you didn't know that about Abraham Lincoln. He's in the National Wrestling Hall of Fame, and reputedly, in his 300-bout career as a younger man, was defeated only once and had some sass talk in the ring as well, once beating an opponent and challenging the crowd to get in there and see if they could beat him too. I mean, he was tall and wiry and, by all accounts, very accomplished. Obviously, he didn't hold a WWE belt, and some of the rumors get wildly exaggerated about him being a regional champion. I mean, these things didn't exist. So it's difficult to know the extent to which the 300-bout claim is correct, but he was certainly a wrestler of some note locally. He's also the first president to hold a patent. A patent for what? A patent for this, which doesn't look very much. But here is a scaled model in the Smithsonian Museum. The patent was for getting boats over shoals in rivers, largely. And what you have here on the bottom of the boat are some bags down here, some bags that could be inflated with the steamboat by redirecting some of the steam to raise the boat up in the water a little and get it over the shoals. The first US president to hold office with a patent. It was never built, it was never used, but still, another first. Wrestler, patent, beard. He's also the first president to have his photograph taken at inauguration. And here it is, right in the center of that picture there. You can see Abraham Lincoln giving his inauguration, which is really quite fascinating. This is March 1865, when he's been re-elected for the second time. But what is more fascinating about this picture than anything else is the fact that standing up above him, very close by, is his assassin, John Wilkes Booth. And this is 1 month, pretty much, just over a month, before Booth ends up shooting him at point-blank range. Well, I mean, the fact that they're so close together here is remarkable. And Booth himself later talked about how, before he actually assassinated him, when he decided he was going to, he said, "What a chance I had at the inauguration only a month ago. I could easily have reached down and shot him from there." So let's have a look at what on earth happened with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln in this day, the 14th of April, 1865. In actual fact, Lincoln had had a premonition about his death only 3 days before Booth killed him. The premonition was in the form of a dream where Lincoln was walking around the White House looking for some lamenting wailing that he could hear but couldn't locate. And then he walked into the East Room in his dream, apparently. He walked into the East Room and he saw on a plinth a coffin with a guard of 6 soldiers around it. And he said, "Well, who here is dead in the White House?" And one of the guards answered him saying, "It is the president, sir." And that's the end of his premonition. Although he insisted that in the dream, the president was somebody else. It wasn't him. You know how dreams are never quite real. Still, 3 days beforehand, he had a premonition that the president would be assassinated. He'd asked the soldier, well, how did he die? And the soldier had told him he would be assassinated. But, he'd had like attempts on his life and threats quite a lot, and he was quite oblivious to this. Someone had previously shot him and then shot at him and had gone through his big top hat, and he used to walk around unguarded sometimes. But in fact, the night of his death, on his table, waiting for him to sign into law or creation, was the Secret Service for a bodyguard unit. Some irony there, given the story that I'm about to tell you, because Booth, who decided he was going to kill Lincoln, probably because he was a sympathizer with the South, a small spy for the South, and had heard Lincoln talk recently about extending voting rights for black people, something he vehemently disagreed with, was actually ready to kill him at the Ford Theatre, which is here. And I'll show you where this is today. So the theatre is obviously the big building, but Booth, in order to pluck up courage, was in the building very next door. And he was drinking in the Star Saloon, trying to pluck up the courage to go and shoot Abraham Lincoln and kill him because he was so furious with him. But what should happen whilst he's drinking there, getting some Dutch courage, is that Lincoln's bodyguard for the evening, John Parker, walks into the Star Saloon and begins drinking with Lincoln's footman and coachman. So it would have been obvious who they were. I mean, these were common people associated with Lincoln. Can you imagine Booth's surprise? Well, this guy, by the way, absolutely should have nothing to do with being bodyguard for the president. Not only had he left his spot, which was to sit outside Lincoln's box at the theatre to prevent anybody from getting in, he'd left it at the intermission so he could go next door and get drunk. But this is not unusual for John Parker. He was a terrible choice for bodyguard detail, a terrible choice for a policeman. He'd been hauled up for bad language and for inappropriate behavior several times as a policeman, but had nothing but a bit of chastisement. He was caught drunk on duty, nothing happened. He was caught sleeping in a streetcar, and when he was found, he said, he was investigating some quacking ducks. It's absurd that this man kept his job. He was once caught frequenting a whorehouse whilst on duty, and his excuse was that the madam had called him to solve a problem. The fact that this man then made the bodyguard detail when the team was formed is astonishing. On the very day that we're talking about, the 14th of April, when he was supposed to take over from the previous bodyguard at 4 p.m., he actually turned up 3 hours late and didn't turn up on duty until 7 p.m. And then they're off to the theatre at 9, and he can't be bothered to do his job for more than an hour and leaves his post outside Lincoln's box to go and get drunk next door in the Star Saloon, where Booth is plucking up Dutch courage as he walks in. Booth takes his opportunity. Booth walks out, walks into the Ford Theatre. As a relatively well-known actor at the time, it would not have been suspicious to see John Wilkes Booth walking around the theatre. He knew all of the staff in the theatre. He had acted in the theatre. Lincoln had even seen him in a play previously at the theatre. He knew the backroom staff as well. So he could be pretty assured to be able to walk around as freely as possible. You can see in this picture here that Lincoln's box is right next to the stage, and I don't get to sit in them very often, but if you have sat in them or even been to the theatre and seen where boxes are, they often overhang the edge of the stage here. And it's laid out, and this is today, it's laid out just as it was when Lincoln was assassinated. Although it's been cleaned up. And he walked, round the back of the theatre, round the aisle, which took you to the box. He went in there. Obviously, the bodyguard was not absent, and John Wilkes Booth was able to walk into Lincoln's box unchallenged and shot him in the back of the head at point-blank range with his Derringer. He carried a knife. He'd planned to execute the Secretary of State and stab him after he'd shot Lincoln. Lincoln slumped forward and then fell backwards and was most likely dead instantaneously, although they took him, they carried him to the White House in the rain afterwards, and he supposedly died in bed. As he pulled the trigger, Booth shouted, "Freedom!" He then proceeded to jump off the box onto the stage to escape. When he landed awkwardly, awkwardly. He got his foot caught in some of the flagging, and he landed awkwardly, injured his left foot, and began to hobble across the stage and shouted things like, freedom for the South. I have the South is avenged. I have done it. Initially, some of the people, because Wilkes was a well-known actor, thought that somehow this was part of the play, but very quickly pandemonium broke out. Booth was chased off the stage. He made his way outside. He actually escaped. He had a horse ready. He bashed the guy looking after his horse and rode off. And he was chased down over the next day or so. And he was eventually shot in the back by a policeman at pretty close range. And that was the end of John Wilkes Booth. And also today, 1865, the end of President Lincoln, who was assassinated in strange circumstances with a premonition of his own death and a completely inappropriate bodyguard who allowed the situation to occur. Anyway, this here is the Ford Theatre. It's still there. It's still a functioning theatre. It's been expanded. And right next to it, you still have the building which was the Star Saloon. I think it closed in 1935, but it has reopened again. It does say Star. I'm not sure if you can have a drink there, although I have been to the Ford Theatre. But you can still go to these same places today. So, remarkable series of events that led to the assassination of President Lincoln. Second event I want to talk to you about today, it happened in 1371 and is an event in the Wars of the Roses. It's the Battle of Barnet. And it's also, I think, the first occasion of friendly fire in combat. And I think that's interesting. So let's have a look. Well, firstly, this is the Wars of the Roses, and I hope that most people know that that's a battle between two different royal houses with lots of nobles who have claims to the throne, between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. And the winners in this battle were the House of York. It's Edward IV, who had kicked out the mentally unstable Henry VI to rule, firstly as regent and then as monarch, only to have Henry VI and some of the noble supporters reinstate him. Edward had been in exile for several years, but he had now come back. He'd marched on London. He'd captured Henry VI for a second time and imprisoned him. And he now, in April 1371, moved north to sorry, it's 1471. Yeah, 1471. He moved north to meet the Lancastrian army, and they met at Barnet, just north of London. Now, when they arrived there, Edward has his brother, who later becomes Richard III. He's the Duke of Gloucester here. I mean, I always think that these artists are never very good. I suppose the excuse is that they were brothers. That's why they look the same. In any case, here we are. They arrive at Barnet. They see the sort of, not the vanguard, but the scouts of the Lancastrian army. They chase them out of the city of Barnet. Night falls, the fog descends, and the two armies prepare to meet the next day just north of the city of Barnet. In the night, though, while the cannon is fired by the Lancastrians, denoted here by the red blocks, at the general position that they thought the Yorkists were in, the Yorkists, Edward moved his army into a hollow in the land to avoid the cannon fire. The cannon fire went over his head, and he thought he could attack early in the morning and catch them by surprise. Now, Edward lined up his army like the Nevilles did, that's Warwick and Montague on the Lancastrian side, in the standard formation of three sections, a left, a centre and a right, with some reserves to crash into battle at an appropriate moment to make a decisive blow. Edward himself was actually very, very tall for the time. He was 6'3", so he was an imposing figure. And research at Oxford University suggests that the average height for a man at this point in time was about 5'7". You can see that here. There you go, about 5'7". So Edward, incredibly imposing figure, decided and always fought at the front of his armies in the center. And he had some gilded armor that he would wear. At 6'3", everyone could see him, and he'd be an inspiring leader in the battle. Gilded means that it had sort of these colorful gold flourishes so that his armor would stand out and shine on the battlefield. And this is how he fought. He also has his brother, like I say, the Duke of Gloucester, Richard III, with him, who is commanding the right section in his first battle. So Gloucester, or Richard, commands the section on the right, and I think he's only 18 years old when he goes into battle, and he's quite renowned as a warrior, the later Richard III. In any case, the fog rises in the morning. The two sides realize that they're slightly misaligned. They're slightly misaligned, and each has their right overlapping the enemy's left, and this seems an obvious place for each of them to strike. The Lancastrians outnumber Edward and the Yorkists probably by about a third. Estimates range between the size of the army. Perhaps the Yorkists, Edward had 10,000 men, and Warwick and the Lancastrians had 15,000, but the numbers go up higher than that in estimates. It's hard to know. What is certain is that they were clearly outnumbered by the Lancastrians. And the battle goes like this. The Earl of Oxford attacks where the advantage is strongest on the right, and collapses Edward's left. Hastings is forced to flee, and Oxford army then disengages from the battle, loots, chases Hastings' retreating army into Barnet, and it takes time for Oxford to regroup his army and come back to help. By the time he is able to do that, the battle has shifted, and because the weight of the right with those misaligned positions means that the battle has turned slightly, about 90 degrees almost, and Richard, leading the right, the Duke of Gloucester, is busy crushing Exeter, but they're still outnumbered. The battle is still uncertain, and at this point Oxford returns to try and help secure victory in the battle. As he is returning, because the lines have shifted, he comes into Montague's flank, and this is the Earl of Oxford's standard. But the standard would simply have been the star with sunbeams on a flag. It wouldn't have been the whole colours necessarily. And the army of the Lancastrians in the centre, Montague's army in the centre, in the sort of foggy morning, see this army arriving on their flank, and they misinterpret the star with sunbeams for Edward VI symbol, which was the star, the shining star. And I can see how on a foggy morning those two symbols might be confused, particularly if it's coming in on your flank, like it does for Montague in the centre. So they end up turning slightly and firing a barrage of arrows at Oxford, and Oxford receiving friendly fire, possibly in a major situation in the battle. This is friendly fire for the first time. Shout treason, treachery, because Montague and Warwick had previously supported Edward IV years ago and are only recent converts to the Lancastrian side. They then fire back at their own centre, accusing them of treason. The centre starts to fold and collapse. Oxford withdraws from the battle, and Edward sees his moment to turn the battle. And he orders his reserves in, and as the centre is confused and collapsing, he crushes it. A rumour goes round on the right that Gloucester has killed Exeter, and then, because of this collapsing chaos in the centre, John Neville, who's Lord Montague, is killed with an axe. Warwick, who is the commander of the armies at the back here, John Neville, sees his brother Richard killed, knows the battle is now lost, sees Oxford leave, and starts to flee himself. The Neville brothers had agreed to fight on foot because the armies were not convinced that they would hang around, having been recent converts to the Lancastrian side. And indeed, John Neville, the Earl of Warwick, is killed fleeing the battlefield with an axe in the back. And that is the end of the Battle of Barnet, a decisive victory, perhaps against the odds. What happened to all the people who survived? Well, Exeter, who was killed on the right in the battlefield and stripped and left for dead on the battlefield, turns out not to be dead, and is brought from the battlefield and jailed. He recovers from his wounds, amazingly, spends 4 years in the Tower of London, and eventually submits to Edward. And then we've got Neville, the Neville brothers, who were killed on the battlefield, Warwick and Montague. Their bodies are stripped and placed in St. Paul's Cathedral for 3 days as proof that everybody can see their bodies, to know that they are dead. We can stop any pretenders or anything else like that. But the Earl of Oxford, who had fled the battlefield under the first incident, perhaps of friendly fire, in disgust, escaped into exile. And he returns some years later. Like I said at the beginning, it's not 3071, it's 4071. He returns some years later to support Henry VII, and is present commanding Henry VII's army at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. So he gets some revenge for the event. But there you are, today, 1471, the Battle of Barnet, decisive battle. There's one more after this, where Henry VI's mother is defeated in a final fling for the Lancastrians, and Edward rules until 1483, when his brother murders the princes and takes over. But that's pretty much the end of the Wars of the Roses by the Battle of Barnet today. So there you have it, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln in strange circumstances, and him fearing his own death, and the very decisive close to the Wars of the Roses in the Battle of Barnet in 1471. That's the 14th of April. One other event happened just before we turned midnight. The Titanic struck an iceberg about 11:30 tonight. But at that point in time, no one was worried. Everyone knows that ship is unsinkable. So that's the 14th of April. I'll see you tomorrow for the 15th. Who knows what we're going to talk about? See you later.